Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Exodus Brothers. This is Micah Knapp.
And this is Jake Knapp.
Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to today's episode, The Myths Behind the Miracles, Understanding the Bible Beyond Literal Interpretation.
We'll also be talking about the importance of understanding the Bible in its historical and cultural context. The Bible was written for specific groups of people, like ancient Israelites, and its stories and teachings reflect their culture, history, and beliefs. We don't believe is relevant today.
We hope to provide rational explanations for why some Bible stories should be viewed as symbolic or allegorical, rather than literal historical accounts.
We'll also be discussing the nature of ancient storytelling and myth-making. Ancient stories and myths help people understand the world, teach values, bring communities together, connect with gods, entertain, share universal ideas, and take part in important traditions.
If one interprets the Bible literally, there's already problems that arise in Genesis that are scientifically incorrect. In Genesis, on day 1, God creates light, separating it from the darkness, calling it day and night. But the sun, moon, and stars are not even created until day 4. On day 3, God creates plants, trees, and vegetation a day before the sun on day 4. Plants obviously need photosynthesis, so this wouldn't make much sense. Also in Genesis 1, humanity is created simultaneously after the plants and animals, but in Genesis 2, Adam is created first, then the plants and animals, and then Eve. And Eve is created almost as an afterthought. In the story of Adam and Eve, they are told not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. At this point, Adam and Eve don't even know the difference between right and wrong, because the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is what would give them that knowledge. God says to them, if you eat of this fruit, you will surely die in the day that you eat this fruit. And of course, it's Eve that leads Adam into sin. She's the one that gives him the fruit. After they eat the fruit, they are cursed with death, mortality, and all future women are cursed with painful childbirth. Because of their sin, you have something called original sin, that because they sinned, all future mankind is cursed. It's passed on to them. So rather than taking personal responsibility, it's inherited sin that we all have from them, which doesn't seem very fair or just.
It also largely just contradicts modern biology, explaining how things evolve over a gradual period of time, and it's a gradual process. And so involving both male and female contributions. So it pretty much goes against everything we know biologically as well.
True, and human beings are far too genetically diverse. It would not be possible for all of humanity to evolve from two people. You'd have something called a population bottleneck if that were the case, and it wouldn't work out.
A lot of incest going on there as well, right?
Right, and so the explanations from apologists, how they sort of rationalize this is that, before sin and before the fall of man, that, we lived in a perfect world and people lived to be 900 years old, and it wasn't until sin entered the world through Adam and Eve. And it's sort of the way I see it is like if you were to take a grenade and throw it into a classroom full of children and they pulled the pin and they didn't know what a grenade was. That's sort of the situation here, because Adam and Eve didn't even know the difference between right and wrong. The tree that they ate from was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So God is punishing them when they didn't even know they were doing anything wrong. They couldn't have. Not to mention, God is typically seen as somebody who is all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful. So he would have known that they were going to do this. But instead, he decides to curse all of humanity from that point forward for the sins of two individuals. And that's passed on as what they call original sin.
Which really you don't get a choice in the matter at that point, right? If you're just born sinful, shouldn't you have a choice to be able to make those decisions?
The idea that people are born sinful and hellbound because of the sins of two individuals is kind of a depraved worldview, and doesn't seem like something that a just and moral God would do.
Exactly. The other thing with the Genesis story is it presents a timeline that suggests the earth and the universe were created in 6 days, and some interpret that as a literal 24-hour period. But, according to that belief system, most Christians believe the earth to be about 6,000 years old, which just, when you look at the rock structures and formations, it doesn't add up. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. It fails on all levels fairly easily if you interpret it literally. Prior to the 19th century, many Christians interpreted the Bible allegorically, and then there was this shift to literal interpretation that became more prominent later on. And with a lot of the big miracles in the Bible, we can see that a lot of the stories in the Bible are definitely influenced by other Near Eastern traditions and myths, Babylonian and Mesopotamian myths such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and things like that were obviously interpreted as allegory, as symbolic. And only really until recent times did people start believing that it was a literal interpretation. And that's where the biggest problems arise.
Up until that point in time, there was the oral tradition. And during that time, a lot of these stories were meant to be told as allegories and metaphors because that's how they told stories back then. That was an historical aspect of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And people are also trying to figure out their place in the universe and how things came to be and what is outside of our existence, what things exist, where people are trying to figure out where does lightning come from and all these kinds of things. And so they create these stories to sort of try and explain the natural phenomena around them because they don't understand it. And there's a lot of cultural borrowing that's pretty evident from the Bible. You see around areas like Mesopotamia, you have the Epic of Gilgamesh. And we'll talk about that because later on we'll talk about the flood. That's one, obviously. But even moral codes, like the Code of Hammurabi, the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was inspired by this Code of Hammurabi. It's one of the oldest moral codes ever written. And Zoroastrianism was another one that had ideas of an afterlife and a resurrection and judgment and heaven and hell and end times. And so there's a lot of cultural borrowing that is pretty evident within the Bible.
Which makes sense because, these are all existing around the same time. And they're coming up with their own versions of these stories. Each culture has their own. If you look at geology and astronomy and other sciences that have established the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, I believe. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion. The processes of cosmic and planetary formations, the development of life occurring over vast, time scales, it just doesn't add up to what is presented in the Bible. And then, of course, there's the young Earth theory, right? We talked about that. That's kind of what most Christians believe in.
Yeah. Another very solid way is looking at light years. We don't know of anything that can move faster than the speed of light. And we can observe with our technology using telescopes and stuff like that, using trigonometry and redshift. We have means that we can tell how far away a star is, or a galaxy for that matter. And so if we can observe that a galaxy is, for example, 2.5 million light years away, that means that the light from that galaxy took 2.5 million years to reach us here on Earth. And likewise, a star that's 10 million light years away. It took 10 million years for that light to reach us on Earth. And so that's just one of many ways that we can observe. And obviously, the universe, the cosmos is massive. I mean, there's trillions of galaxies. The more we learn about it and the more we observe it, the more vast it becomes. It just doesn't make any sense to believe in an Earth that is only a few thousand years old.
Not to mention that, but that we're the center of the universe, as previously thought. But it's as soon as we started using the scientific method, a lot of these stories fell apart because they didn't align with what we were learning based on observational facts and statistics.
Yep.
The other thing we can add on to this subject is the topic of dinosaurs, dinosaur bones, and carbon dating and dating the fossils to millions of years old. And we can see that in the rock formations, the layers of sediment, and how many years each layer is, right?
Yeah. And one of the early explanations for that to try and disprove that was that people would say that the devil was trying to trick us by putting dinosaur bones in the earth, or to make science the enemy, to make religion make sense. We have to create these wild ideas that are just ridiculous.
Right. Exactly. I mean, it's again observational science versus faith and mythology and stories that are made up. They conflict because they don't add up.
Indeed. A lot of it comes down to the God of the gaps fallacy. If we don't understand anything, we insert God. It's arguing from ignorance. It's fine to say we don't know. We don't know what happened. We don't know how it started. We should normalize saying I don't know. And maybe one day we'll have the answer. Maybe we never will. So second up is another well-known story in the Bible. It's the Exodus story and the parting of the Red Sea. So there's many, many reasons why we know this didn't actually happen. If you're thinking it was a literal story, there's all sorts of problems. So first of all, God comes to Pharaoh and tells him to set his people free because the Israelites are supposedly captive in Egypt for, I think, 430 years. There's actually no historical or archaeological evidence for the Israelites being held slaves in Egypt. The Egyptians were excellent record keepers, and they never mentioned this. And so right off the bat, that's a problem. So basically what happened is God is telling the Pharaoh to let his people go. But then there's a part where God even says that he's going to harden the Pharaoh's heart. And even when he wants to let him go, he's going to harden his heart. Because the Pharaoh decides not to let the people go, what does he do? He punishes the children. So he kills all the firstborn children of Egypt, which again is punishing somebody for somebody else's sin or whatever. And again, the Egyptian record doesn't talk about any of these things, the plagues that supposedly befell Egypt as a result. None of those are mentioned. And so eventually the Israelites escape, and they're led by Moses across the Red Sea. And you're talking about roughly 2 to 3 million people between women and children and the men. And they go across the Red Sea, and Pharaoh and his armies follow them, and there's roughly 600 chariots and thousands of soldiers, and they get swallowed up in the sea. There's this big miracle that happens. The sea opens up, and then it swallows all the soldiers. And yet not a single shred of evidence has ever been found to support that ever happened. And then you have this massive migration of millions of people in the desert for 40 years, which doesn't make any sense. And another point to that is that the number 40 in the Bible is used repeatedly to refer to symbolically long periods of time or testing. Jesus prayed for 40 days and 40 nights, and it rained in the flood for 40 days and 40 nights. And so this number 40 is a recurring theme, symbolic number. So if you take it literally, it doesn't make any sense that they would be wandering around the desert aimlessly for 40 years after they just escaped and had this big miracle occur. Archaeologists and historians have found evidence of small tribes of just a few thousand people living for a few years in areas like that. And yet here you have a massive group of people that are out there for 40 years, and they haven't found a single thing that could corroborate that as a historical event. But again, it goes back to a God who is supposedly just, and he's murdering innocent children, which doesn't seem very pro-life, to get at the Pharaoh because the Pharaoh was disobedient in letting these people go, which there was never any evidence for. So again, this is one of those ones that, if taken at face value, it falls apart at every single instance.
Right, and this is a recurring theme and a topic we're going to talk about, is how God of the Old Testament is not very pro-life at all, according to modern-day Christians. There are so many times that he murders his people and wipes people out, and we're going to bring that up a few times, but another point that we can talk about later on is that really it's a pro-birth movement as opposed to pro-life, and there's repeated instances of God wiping people out and killing them.
There are multiple stories where the Israelites are, first of all, they're selected as the chosen people, God's chosen people, so he's picking favorites. And then they're instructed to commit genocide against the Canaanites, the Amalekites, the Midianites. There's very graphic detail in how they need to do this. They need to kill every man, woman, child, unborn child, animal, slaughter them all till there's no one left breathing.
Yeah. Another reason for the Israelites' shift towards monotheism was not just theological, it was a response to historical challenges they were facing at the time, most particularly the threat of annihilation and the need to preserve a unique identity because they were being wiped out at the time. And most people believed in, multiple gods at the time. So the belief in one God provided a way for them, the Israelites, to understand their place in the world and to endure all this hardship and have hope for some divine justice and salvation. So sort of in this way, their concept of one true God is both spiritual and practical response to the turmoil and destruction they were facing at the time.
Yeah, and even the idea of the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh was believed to be a regional deity, a desert storm god, if you will. It sort of ended up absorbing aspects of other Canaanite gods. You had other gods like El and Baal. And over time, Yahweh's worship was purged of competing deities, leading to a strict monotheism. Interestingly, as a little side note, in 2020, a study analyzed residues from 2 altars at the ancient shrine of Tel Arad in Israel. And what they found were the residues of incense that they were burning at the altars contained 2 main ingredients, frankincense and cannabis.
Interesting.
So they were actually burning cannabis resin to the god Yahweh.
And we'll get more into that too, but, the God asking people to sacrifice animals, how bizarre that sounds now.
There's all sorts of problematic Bible verses in the Old Testament, and most Christians can't really reconcile that very well. And so what you end up having is Christian apologists will try and rationalize that maybe there is some sort of a progressive revelation in God's morality that was laid out over time or whatever. But that doesn't really hold up because there were things that God said immediately that they should do or not do, like such as you should not eat shellfish or wear garments of 2 different materials, things like that. And yet he never mentioned anything about, thou shalt not own slaves. He actually gave instruction for how to treat your slaves. Slavery has got to be one of the biggest issues of the Old Testament that people either want to completely ignore or try and say that somehow, it was a cultural thing, right? So people during that time had slaves. But apparently God was okay with it at that time because God gives instruction on how to treat your slaves Exodus 21, verse 20 through 21. You can beat your slaves with a rod as long as they don't die after a day or two, since they are your property. Exodus 21, 7 through 11 talks about selling daughters into slavery. And it's very much the chattel slavery of like the transatlantic slave, where people are essentially property. They're movable property like heads of cattle that you can not only own, it gives you instructions on how you can buy them and how long you can have them. You can own these slaves as property and give them to your kids as inheritance. And you're allowed to beat them as long as they don't die after a day or two. So rather than saying and revealing over time that slavery is wrong, or just outright saying slavery is wrong, you should not own other human beings, most people can see that as a moral wrong. And yet the God of the Bible never addresses it. The God of the Old Testament says, these are how you treat your slaves. And there's even references in the New Testament where God says, slaves respect your masters just as you would follow Christ.
And that makes you wonder, right? Again, we'll talk about this a lot, but is it a God saying these things, or is it that that's culturally at the time what was acceptable and what they were engaged in and were attributing to God?
Yeah, it's people wanting to rationalize their ability to own other human beings. And so, of course, you could just claim that you heard, God told me that I can own some humans. So you would think that a God who is moral and just would say, no, it's wrong to own other people.
Right. It kind of goes hand in hand with, what's mentioned in the Ten Commandments and what should have been mentioned and what isn't mentioned in there. That should say everything to you right there. That's just one instance where you should say, hey, God's saying slavery is okay. This is maybe more attributed to the people writing the book as opposed to God actually saying it.
It's interesting because the way that some Christians want to respond to things like that, like slavery or genocide in the Bible, is they'll say, well, that was the Old Testament. Now we have a New Testament. That was a cultural thing that was done. But if God is not changing and God is a moral God and God is a perfect God, why was he okay with slavery at one point in time? And that's what they can't reconcile. You have to perform some mental gymnastics and twist yourself in a pretzel to try and rationalize or come up with an excuse as to why that was okay and why God gave instruction on how to treat your slaves versus God just saying, hey, this is wrong, you shouldn't do it. And so some Christians want to do away with the Old Testament. They're like, well, that was the Old Testament. We can kind of do away with that. But they don't realize if you do away with the Old Testament, you do away with the Ten Commandments. And what maybe would have been a better suggestion is to replace one of the commandments. And I can think of one off the top of my head is the fourth commandment, which is keep the Sabbath day holy. That was a ceremonial law. It was not a moral one. So you could replace that maybe with thou shalt not own slaves.
Thou shalt not rape.
Thou shalt not rape your slaves.
Yep. I mean, if people like you and I can feel this way now, yet an all-knowing, omnipotent God is okay with it at one particular point in time because it was culturally acceptable at the time in that area, I feel like many Christians today often dismiss the Old Testament, asserting that Jesus transformed or fulfilled its laws, rendering much of it obsolete. Yet I feel like paradoxically, they frequently draw upon the Old Testament passages to justify condemnation and judgment, particularly regarding topics like homosexuality. To me, the selective approach really exposes an inconsistency and the real hypocrisy of this all, where these outdated laws are set aside when inconvenient, but then brought up again to reinforce deeply rooted biases, which just continues to reveal the tension between what's really the scriptural interpretation, doctrinal evolution, and contemporary cultural prejudices.
Yeah. People also use the Old Testament to rationalize, they've used it to rationalize slavery.
Yes.
If you look at our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson actually owned a black slave who was his sex slave. And so you have people like that even if they're saying one thing, they still own slaves. And it led to people selling slaves. And, the whole Civil War, you had Christians that were basically using the Bible to justify slavery. Now, granted, you also had Christians that were arguing against it because of things like the New Testament. Although it's never mentioned in the Bible anywhere, God never addresses the issue of slavery. He never says, by the way, that's no longer cool to do. I know I was for it at one point, and I was giving instruction on how to treat your slaves, but now I'm going to turn a new leaf, and I'm going to tell people to turn the other cheek and treat everybody with respect, and things are changed now. But
right, he's changing, and he's changing his positions.
Right. Jesus, the guy that died on the cross for our sins, who wants you to love your neighbor and love the foreigner, the alien, like the person that lives near you, is the same God in the Old Testament that was okay with genocide and with slavery. If Jesus is God, that is the same person. And so you have to ask yourself, either God changed over time and his morals changed, or the Bible is just inconsistent.
Exactly. And I would say to follow that up that God seems incredibly insecure and narcissistic in the Old Testament. there's a great focus on his worry of people worshiping other gods, right? Idolizing other gods. I mean, that's one of the 10 commandments. So it seems like, why is that the focus rather than these sort of humanistic issues that are far more important today even,
Yeah, the first 3 commandments are essentially, love the Lord your God, have no other gods, make no graven images unto me, don't take the Lord's name in vain. The first 3 are about God. He seems like a very insecure individual before he gets down to things like that maybe he should have mentioned, like don't rape and don't own slaves. If you're trying to come up with a legal code, right, a moral code for people, it seems like there's ways to improve upon it today.
Right. And now to kind of go back into the subject we were kind of discussing, which is the wrath of God, is the story of God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son.
Right. There's several instances in the Bible where God is like testing people's faith or whatever. And so God asks Abraham to sacrifice his own son. And it's only when he has him laid on a slab and he's getting ready to raise a knife up to stab his son and kill him, an angel comes and says, wait, stop, God changed his mind. You don't have to do this anymore. And so, God testing people like that is just such a depraved thing. As a father, I would never, ever, ever even consider doing that for any God. I would throw myself in front of a train or a bullet to protect my son, and I would easily die. I would do anything for my son. I would never, ever sacrifice my son. And the idea that that's what God asks just as a way to like test his faith or something is just such a narcissistic and depraved thing to do.
Right, on every level, pretty much. If it's an allegory, it fails there as well. But if it's actually, happened to a person, you would be curious about their mental stability, right? Or today, if that happened today, we would, throw them in an asylum, right? They're saying that God was trying to kill their son. And yet, if God is really doing that, if he's really doing that, then that's even worse because you're having God's testing you to kill your own son.
Right. And there's things like that. I mean, if you look at Christianity, it's all about God sacrificing his son.
Sort of this sacrifice death cult, really, in a way.
Sacrificing yourself isn't much of a sacrifice if you're immortal. God sacrificing his son, who happens to be immortal, isn't really a sacrifice. It's like he died and then 3 days later he came back. So what did he really give up? What did he really sacrifice?
Bingo. This is a major point here. If Jesus is God and immortal, then his sacrifice loses the finality and vulnerability that makes a true sacrifice meaningful, right? Dying temporarily, to me, only to return in glory, seems more like a demonstration of power rather than something genuine and permanent. So the second story we have in that to deal with the wrath of God is God's punishment of Job, testing his faith.
Yes. And in Job, God basically allows Satan to torment and torture Job to test his faith. And so what happens? His livestock is killed. His servants that are watching the livestock, they're killed. His kids are in a house and the house collapses on them and kills his children. He's ostracized by his community. He loses all his wealth. He gets covered in horrible boils all over his body. And because he endures it, and after all these tragic things happen, then God repays him with wealth and more children and pats him on the back and tells him what a good job he's done.
Just another example of God, quote unquote, testing people, but it seems like kind of a narcissistic, evil thing to do in a way.
I think the real issue comes in when innocent people are again punished on behalf of somebody he's testing. So Job is the one being tested, and yet it's his children that suffer and his children die, and it's his servants that die, and all these things happen. They didn't do anything wrong, and so there's innocent people being slaughtered simply for the testing of somebody's faith.
Right, and again, it's these stories are somehow they don't happen anymore. Somehow God has again changed over time because back then he was very judgmental and condemning, testing people. Is it that most Christians now are claiming that the New Testament, Jesus coming, sort of wipes that out?
It becomes very convenient to cherry pick and focus on the New Testament and the good things, but you wouldn't have the New Testament without the Old Testament. And the Old Testament is full of genocide and slavery and all these horrific testing of people's faiths and all these things that happen that you really can't reconcile. Interestingly, the early Gnostic Christians believed that the God of the Old Testament was a lesser sort of evil God, the demiurge that created life, and that Jesus was like the one that brought the truth to the world. And in that way, that sort of makes a little bit more sense. It doesn't fix everything, but it sort of makes a little bit more sense versus somebody who's doing that, who's now saying a totally different message. And so it doesn't really add up for me when you look at the old and the new and saying it's the same God. It just doesn't really make sense.
But to me, it just sounds like what you'd expect from the time and the people that wrote it at the time.
Right. It's what you'd expect from the culture of that time. People claiming that it was God or some authority that they were given to do these things. And that was always the biggest red flag for me. Anytime somebody said God told me, it's like, well, why would God tell you something to tell me when he could just tell me directly? If he wants to do it, he can tell me directly. And I haven't heard anything from him, so.
Yeah, and historically, why at the time is God choosing favorites? Why is he choosing the Israelites over other people? So he's choosing one pocket of people against another pocket of people.
Yeah, even before you get to the genocide stories where it's problematic from the get-go, the fact that God is all loving and loves everybody equally, and he's picking his favorite children, essentially, and he's putting them above other nations and other people groups. So that's already problematic. And then those people are told to go and commit genocide and kill the Canaanites and kill the Amalekites and kill these other groups of people. And I've heard the excuses from Christian apologetics, and William Lane Craig is a well-known one. And for example, when the Israelites killed the Canaanites, he said, I was trying to think of who could possibly be harmed when this happened, because when the children got killed, they went straight to heaven. The men and the women, when they got killed, it was because they were too morally corrupt or evil, and that was why they deserved to die. And then when it came to who possibly could be harmed in all of this, he actually said that maybe the Israelite soldiers had a little bit of PTSD from slashing the throats of children in their sleep. Maybe that kind of kept them up at night. Maybe that bothered them, that they had to thrust swords through pregnant women and slaughter these people. And that was, maybe they were the only people who were harmed in that, which is a pretty disgusting thing to say.
Exactly. And then you have, people using prayer, and God's answering some people's prayers, but not other people's prayers. And if it's free will, or if it's meant to be, what's the point of praying at that point? We mentioned the Holocaust, how I'm sure lots of those, God's chosen people, the Jews, were being wiped out, historical numbers, and they were obviously, I'm sure a lot of them were praying, right?
If there was ever a reason to answer a prayer, it would have been for the 6 million Jews who were slaughtered in the Holocaust. I mean, it was a horrific thing, and the Nazis lost in the end. That's all good, but they didn't get their prayers answered in time. And people just say, well, that wasn't part of the plan or whatever. But if God has a plan, then free will doesn't exist. And there's a lot of issues I have with free will. Like, free will is only really meaningful if choices exist. And if we look at the world today, we have, 20 to 24,000 people die of starvation every day, mostly kids under the age of 5. And they're born in war-torn areas, where they can't make any meaningful choices in their life to have any different outcome. So I would argue they do not have free will. And to blame it on somebody else is wrong. So if you argue that God is all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful, then he would be able to do something about that. But the free will thing doesn't really hold much water for me. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 33 says, God is not a God of confusion. We have thousands of Christian denominations, and none of them can agree on what is descriptive, prescriptive, allegorical, or literal. You have the Catholic Church, and you have Russian Orthodox, and they split, and they both think they're the original church. And then you have Protestantism, and you have all these thousands and thousands of denominations, and none of them can agree on anything. I think that's problematic, and I think it shows that the Bible is a very confusing book. Some people believe in a Trinity, some people do not. Some people believe in a literal hell. Nobody can agree on anything. And even if you look at the God of the Old Testament, the God of Abraham, for example, Jews and Muslims believe in that same God. They just don't acknowledge or believe that Jesus was the Messiah. They believe he was a prophet. And so it seems like it could have been written to address a lot of the confusion that we have today with it, which is very problematic.
Yeah, and of course, the Catholic Church decided what went in the Bible, what was excluded, right? There's the Gnostic Gospels.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it's a mix of allegory, poetry, and maybe some history. So you have people taking it all in one context and assuming it's all the Word of God, as opposed to its various forms of art and different forms of writing, which you should be able to separate because they're very different. Poetry is very different from historical story or most of the stories, which I believe are allegorical, Jonah and the whale. And so you have that amalgamation.
People tend to look at the Bible as a book, and it's really a library of books. It was written by roughly 40 different authors, and the Old Testament was written over a 1,000-year time period. There's a lot of cultural borrowing that we talked about. So you have the long lifespans that are in the Bible, which is another one that falls apart if you believe the Bible's literal. Do you believe that people lived to be 900 years old? The long lifespans was actually borrowed from the Sumerian king lists, where it was mentioned that kings ruled for thousands of years. And you have things like Psalms and Proverbs, which sound very, very similar to Egyptian wisdom literature. And then you have things like revenge fantasy, which is Samson, David and Goliath, the plagues of Egypt, the cursing of the boys of Elisha.
People back then lived shorter lifespans, not longer ones back then. It would make sense, with disease and things that we didn't have cures for back then. They would actually die out earlier on.
We have a lot of evidence from like bog bodies that we've discovered that are, 4,000 or 5,000 years old, people that are really well preserved to the point where they can analyze the contents of their stomach and figure out what they had for breakfast before they died. A lot of these people are maybe 40 or 50 years old, which is what you'd expect. But, again, if you believe the earth is only 6,000 years old and you go back 5,000 years or whatever, there was nobody living anywhere close to where they're living the lifespans of today.
Yeah, and to get to the flood narrative, on one hand, he flooded the earth because people were too evil, right? And they were committing too many sins and they had gone astray. Humans do the same things now that they were doing back then. There's nothing different. So to wipe them out back then, but then just go back to what was happening before, what's the difference,
Right.
For one thing, there's historical and geological evidence or lack thereof for global flood. People didn't know about global geography at the time. So if we're taking this story literally, there could have been a local flood, right? But we have records of other cultures from 5,000 years ago that you can trace the lineages of, and it doesn't make sense that, they would have had a similar story in their history books, right? Or they would have talked about it.
If you look at the timeline and you go back based on the figures of the Bible and you believe in the young earth creation, that the earth is only 6,000 years old, that becomes especially problematic because the flood would have occurred roughly, according to this logic, 5,000 years ago or something like that. And there were cultures that were thriving and existing, and there wasn't any gap in their art or their culture whatsoever during this time period. The Chinese culture, the Egyptian culture, the Sumerian culture, there's all these cultures that existed that didn't have any mention of this. I mean, there's other, obviously, stories, but there was not a gap of anything that occurred there. There's no gap in things that were happening in the world. And if you see it as like a local flood, it doesn't really make sense because the whole point was to wipe out humanity because they were too sinful. But you have other, again, cultural borrowing. So the Epic of Gilgamesh was another Mesopotamian flood story, and there's several of those. But the whole thing is just, from a logistical, literal standpoint, is just ridiculous. Not to mention the fact that other people had boats. Boats exist all over the world, so people would have been able to ride out the storm. But then you have all sorts of other issues. There's zero evidence of it anywhere. There would be a fossil record of this, for another thing. And then you have, again, going back to the number 40, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. This has been shown to be symbolic, a symbolic number that's used throughout the Bible. And so, again, if you think about it, like it was a literal thing that happened. Suppose the storm is over and they've managed to survive, Noah and his family, and they get out, and all of the predators wait for all the prey to reproduce before they eat them.
Right, and then we're also going back to the Adam and Eve, story that it's got to be incest again, right? Because it's only family once again.
And God supposedly gives people free will, and yet he decides that people are just too evil with their free will, so he's got to get rid of them. So what does this sound like? This sounds like a God of cancel culture. You haven't even got a chance for redemption and changing your ways, potentially. I'm just going to end your life prematurely, and I'm going to override your free will. So why did he give them free will to begin with? And then he feels regret. If you knew this was going to happen, why would you feel regret? Why would you feel like you've made a mistake? Why would you feel sad? You knew this was going to happen. These are your own rules that you created.
Yeah, I think the free will one's a big one here, too, because I thought we were supposed to be able to live our life and choose our actions and choose, what we did. So why would we be prematurely wiped out?
Right. There's supposed to be a judgment day where at the end of our lives, we are judged for our actions, both good and evil. And so that's where it seems like judgment should come, not prematurely, not while we're still on the earth, while there's still a chance for us to reform or change our ways potentially. Like that's what redemption is, right? They weren't given that chance. And not only that, but you have innocent people here too. You have unborn children. So again, God doesn't seem like he's very pro-life here. He's killing pregnant women are being drowned, and these babies' lives are being destroyed before they've even been born. So how is that a fair and just action?
Right. It's another example of God not being pro-life.
Definitely not. And then all of humanity needs to restart from a single family, which again, it goes back to the issue that we had in Genesis, the genetic bottleneck and incest and all those things that would occur.
And then there's the whole issue of, at the end of this, all God has, there's a rainbow in the sky, and God is a symbol of how he will never flood the earth again. But Our understanding of science, of course, contradicts this, knowing that.
We can actually explain. I can create rainbows for you if you like. It's very simple. You have a light source, you have moisture in the atmosphere, you have reflection and refraction, and light is dispersed and it creates a rainbow. Did rainbows not exist prior to the flood? There's people that actually think that rainbows literally were invented by God as a sign and have only existed since the flood. So rainbows have only been around for a few thousand years. They never occurred before that time.
Yeah, how did the rainbow get in the sky, Jake?
And it seems obvious. Like, what are the symbolic interpretations of the flood story? Well, water is seen as something cleansing. The flood story could symbolize the destruction of chaos and corruption, the cleansing and renewal of creation, the hope of redemption and human transformation. That's an okay thing. But again, why do you have to fall back on symbolism that involves the murder of innocent people? It seems like a really bad symbolism. If these are not literal interpretations, they also fail because they're just really bad symbols and they're really bad metaphors.
Right, and it once again just points to the idea of, this being written by people at the time.
It's the age-old story of us versus them. It's we are the good guys, you are the bad guys, my God can beat up your God, nana boo boo, and I'm going to kill you now.
But also we're asking, why would God do these things now? Because we have a different understanding of the world and science. And, these stories at the time might have been more interesting to people or connected to people. But now we would question, why would God do that? Why would God wipe people out in that manner without giving them the choice to live their life and make their own decisions? And then at the end, be judged by God and, oh, you're going to hell, or...
Right. And again, if people do have issues and they say, well, that's the Old Testament, that's no longer needed. Well, the Old Testament is still part of the Bible, for one. The Old Testament is still supposedly the divinely inspired word of God. The Old Testament is still the same God that's supposedly Jesus. And so if morality doesn't change, if God doesn't change, this seems to be in pretty stark contrast with what we read. It just doesn't seem to add up.
Well, also, I would add to that oftentimes judgmental Christians will use the Old Testament specifically as a way to back up their agenda, and their insecurities or their judgments on others is usually backed up by the Old Testament.
A lot of Christians haven't even read the entire Bible. They go to church and they hear select Bible verses and stories that are inspirational and they make them feel good. But when you confront the problematic parts that are in the Bible, it's really hard to reconcile for people. And there's not really any way to, other than mental gymnastics and twisting themselves into pretzels, there's no real way to address it. I've heard the best explanations from all of the top Christian apologists, and their answers just do not make any sense to me. It does not add up at all for me. So another one that, again, is if it's literal, it's horrific, and if it's an allegory, it's still horrible. Here it is. 2 Kings 2:23-25. Elisha is going up the mountain, and there's a group of boys who mock him and call him Baldy. Hey, Baldy, get out of here, or whatever. And so because he's insulted and called Baldy, he calls down a curse on the kids who mock him, and 2 bears come out of the woods and maul 42 of the boys. And that's the story. Deuteronomy 22:22. If a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, they both must die.
Right, there's a lot of misogyny.
There's a lot of subjugation of women as well. That's another classical theme that you see played out here. And here's one that's super messed up. And I'd love to know why this was okay with God at the time, even if it was a cultural thing. Here we go. Deuteronomy 22:28-29. If a man meets a virgin who has not been pledged to be married, and he rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver, and he must marry her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. So he rapes a virgin, and because he does that and is discovered, he has to marry her, and she has to stay married to him. You can marry your rape victim.
It's almost like men at the times are writing this from the quote-unquote word of God when it's things that they want to be the laws at the time, right?
Yep. 1 Corinthians 14:34. Women shall be silent in the church. And Paul says in 1 Timothy 2:11-12, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet.
There's a lot of evangelical churches that still preach that. I mean, women can't be pastors, and that they're supposed to be, submissive housewives, essentially 1950s style.
It makes sense. If you look at all of it in its entirety, Adam being created first, and then Eve was sort of a servant for Adam, and women is to serve man, and all of these things reflect a patriarchal society, nothing more. It's why God is a he and why, God is always referred to as a he.
I mean, it is the patriarchal structure, and it makes sense, again, because it was written at the time by people at the time, and it's humans writing this, not God.
Yep. Let's talk about the Gospels. So first off, right off the bat, the Gospels were written anonymously. Nobody knows who actually wrote them, but they were attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by the early church. They also were not eyewitnesses. The earliest Gospel was believed to be Mark, and it was written roughly around 60, 70 AD, something like that. So it's written 30-ish years after the death of Jesus. Mark is the first gospel, and then you have Matthew and Luke that are essentially saying the same thing, but there actually is a lot of contradictions between them if you read horizontally. So if you read one verse in one book and one verse in another, there's some issues that pop up. And there's many, many different contradictions that pop up, but some of the most obvious ones, and I think the most problematic ones, are these. Matthew traces Jesus' lineage through Joseph, linking him to Abraham, David, and Solomon. Meanwhile, Luke traces his lineage to Adam, all the way back to Adam. Then you have the issue of the census, which historically the Romans would do a census for the purposes of collecting taxes. But there was never any indication throughout history that people during that time of the census had to travel to their ancestral home. So it seems there's a narrative device being used by the author to fulfill the prophecy in the Hebrew scriptures. The prophecy is found in Micah 5, verse 2, which states that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. One of the authors of the Gospels is trying to put Jesus to be born in Bethlehem. The Gospel of Mark also does not mention a virgin birth, only Matthew and Luke do. So it seems like there's also a theological development. And there's several cases of this that happen in the Gospels, but that's just one particular thing. In my mind, that's pretty problematic. They're basically they have sources, and they're getting their information from word of mouth, hearsay upon hearsay.
Then, of course, there's the virgin birth, right? This story that, God, there was no father. So, it's just right from God, immaculate conception. And the theory that maybe Mary slept with the Roman soldier and, wanted to cover that up.
Yeah, it is interesting that the Gospel of Mark does not mention the virgin birth at all. Like, you think that would be if that was an important part of the story, that would have been mentioned.
Yeah, let's really get into it, right? So there's a lot of issues here. The progression from Mark to John in the New Testament shows how each gospel author is adding sort of theological depth and reinterpretation, at the same time while introducing inconsistencies in the portrayal of events. So Mark is the earliest, right? He presents Jesus primarily as a suffering servant type with minimal theological reflection and sort of a stark, urgent narrative. Meanwhile, Matthew and Luke expand on this, each offering their own unique perspectives. So Matthew emphasizes Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy, while Luke focuses on universal salvation and social justice. However, there's a lot of discrepancies that arise here, such as variations in the details of the tomb story, the empty tomb, right? Mark mentions a young man in the tomb, while Matthew, Luke, and John offer differing accounts of the angels or figures present. Finally, you have John, the last gospel. He introduces a high Christology, right? Portraying Jesus as the divine logos and shifts the focus from historical narrative to theological reflection, essentially. And I feel like these are major differences that are highlighting the evolving nature of the gospel tradition. As you can see, each author, based on when they were written, are adding things onto the story as it's going along. If you look at what we believe is the earliest gospel to the last gospel. And it's really this sort of fantasy element that's creeping in, that's really becoming mythologized and is becoming this whole legendary story. Each person's adding on a little piece to the whole story until it's, we're playing the telephone game, right? And the time it's gotten around, it's changed quite a bit. And passed down through the generations, and here we are now.
And there's also a lot of interesting foreshadowing that happens in the Bible that you would expect from a fictional story. And an example of that would be Jesus when I think he's 12 years old and he's gone missing, and Mary and Joseph are looking for him, and they finally find him. 3 days later, he is found in the temple. So it's a foreshadowing of his death and resurrection 3 days later. He disappears and reappears 3 days later. And that's the kind of thing you would expect to see in a fictional story, a narrative device that's used, this foreshadowing.
Right, or the idea that maybe each author, person that's tackling these stories or passing them down or translating them or transcribing them or adding little pieces along the way.
Certainly also, if you think about it, they didn't have printing presses back then. So in order to make copies of the Gospels, they would use a scribe, and the scribe would make errors, and he would have to make a copy and then make a copy of a copy. And so multiple copies of copies of copies, and then translations into different languages, and all sorts of problematic things can happen just from human error. How can you preserve that if there's errors that are being made and words are being changed or parts are being left out, some of it accidentally, some of it intentionally? But there's all sorts of problems that happen, even just going from one language to another. Things are lost, and then making copies of copies of copies of translations of copies.
There's also the factor of looking outside the Bible, as far as were there references to Jesus that existed outside of that, or that do exist outside of that?
Sure, and the ones that are given are usually very brief. A key one would be Josephus, who was a Jewish historian. What he wrote about Jesus was around 93 AD, and all he mentioned was Jesus was a wise man who did wonderful works, and he was essentially crucified by the Romans. And that's where it ends. It doesn't ever talk about a resurrection. And you think that, again, that's a super key part of the story. That is the most important part of the story. If he's going to mention this guy being crucified, and if Jesus had actually resurrected, you'd think that that would have been worth mentioning. And there are others that mention a figure of early Christianity, but nothing is ever mentioned of a resurrection.
Right. It makes you wonder if, yes, was there an historical Jesus, and did he exist? But is that the same Jesus that we see in the Bible? Are there exaggerations that have become mythologized? Over time that they're adding to it, that the story is maybe there was a guy named Jesus who was a prophet who had some, wise things to say, that had followers. I feel like there's always a kernel of truth in some of these stories that get elaborated on over time.
A good example of that is like if in 200 years somebody read a story about Harry Potter or Spider-Man and they're mentioning actual places like New York, that isn't any reason to believe that Spider-Man is real. So it's historical fiction, I would say. You have maybe some places that are real and some people that are real, and then there's all of the supernatural, crazy miracles and things that are added to it. And all of these things that happened, supposedly before the invention of the camera. I find it a little telling.
It seems a little convenient, as to your point, that, these amazing, big, spectacular things happen back, in the biblical days with God showing himself in some fashion, and yet that doesn't happen ever now,
There were also other people that existed at the same time who were miracle workers. There was a whole list of people that did things like healed the sick and supposedly raised people from the dead. They didn't claim to be divine, but they were known and talked about during that time period.
Yeah, before the New Testament and the story of Jesus, there were many ancient cultures that had myths and religious stories that contained elements super similar to the Christian narrative. The stories often involved divine figures, miraculous births, death, and resurrection themes. Some of the most well-known are, I'll give you a list. We have the Egyptian god Horus, son of Osiris and Isis. He was associated with the life, death, and renewal aspect, just like Jesus. You had the Persian god Mithras, again dealing with the death and rebirth storyline, and was also popular around the time that Christianity began. There's the Hindu god Krishna, who also performed miracles, healed the sick, and raised the dead, and similar themes of love, redemption, and salvation. There was a Greek hero, Hercules, who overcame death, and the Roman god Attis, who also died and was resurrected. So there's a lot of the virgin birth storylines happening, repeating, and there's also the death and resurrection happening again and again and again, and stories that were made up from around the same time as Jesus as well.
And then, again, going back to the historical parts and the things that are problematic with the history of it all, it may have been Jewish tradition to bury people the day that they died or the day after they died, whatever, but it was not Roman practice. So when people were crucified, it was meant to be a warning to others, like this is what happens when you cross Rome. So if Jesus had been crucified, and we look at other examples of people who were crucified, they were always left on the cross to be picked apart by birds until their body was rotting, and then that was like a symbol to people, like do not cross Rome. So it's highly unlikely that Jesus would have been allowed to be taken down and buried in a tomb conveniently. That, again, doesn't align with what we know of the time period historically with the Romans. Especially
if they were angry at him for being this kind of rebel, right, that was not adherent to the laws at the time. I think they would have been like, here's an example of what's going to happen to you, Jesus specifically, because he really pissed them off. Also, I think you mentioned this maybe already, but sacrificing yourself isn't much of a sacrifice if you're immortal.
Right.
It seems a bit like a contradiction. He sacrificed himself briefly and then was resurrected.
The entire thing is ridiculous because if a God is all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, and he's made these things and he doesn't like the way that things are going, he could just forgive us. That's all he has to do is forgive us. Instead, what does God do? He sends himself in the form of his son to come to earth to be tortured and killed so that he can sacrifice himself to convince himself to forgive us for the rules that he created in the first place. So God is creating a loophole for rules that he himself has created. Logically, it doesn't make any sense. The death of Jesus is also very useless if the sins that he died for can still take someone to hell. So if he died for our sins, but you can still do something that results in you going to hell, what's the point?
It's like you're watching a movie that isn't very good and there's a lot of plot holes and you're trying to stick with the story, but it isn't making any sense and just doesn't add up. That's what it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it. It's maybe not technically a cult, but I would say Christianity is a cult of human sacrifice, and sacrifice of children is abhorrent. And if you read the Bible literally, it either makes no sense or barbaric sense. Some of the miracles that Jesus does to sort of prove that he's divine, a lot of those also fall flat for me because, for example, there's Jesus is at a wedding and they run out of wine, and culturally that was like, oh no, we've run out of wine. What do we do here? And so he turns water into wine at that wedding feast. That seems like a pretty trivial, almost like a party trick.
At this point, why doesn't God just come out and say, look, I exist and here is all the things I can do and you should, believe in me? It seems like it's just this big game that's being played. I guess my question is, why is it this whole big game to whether we believe in him or not, as opposed to that we're living a life that is morally just and not evil, as opposed to this big test of whether we believe in him or not? Because you could be a good person and you could do great things on the earth, but you could not believe in God. But then does that mean you're going to go to hell then at that point? That doesn't make sense to me.
Right, exactly. That was also a big part of Micah deconstruction, was knowing that I had friends from India that are Hindu. And that all goes back to the fact that your religion largely has to do with where you were born, geographically, where you were born. If you're born in India, you're most likely going to be a Hindu. If you're born in Thailand, you're most likely going to be a Buddhist. If you're born in America, you're most likely going to be a Christian. And I have multiple friends that are Hindus, and they live a life that's way more in line with Christ than the vast majority of Christians that I've known throughout my life. And if they live a life that's more in line with Christ, and yet they believe in different gods, and they're going to be punished for eternity, infinite punishment for finite crimes is what that is. And so that was one of the things that really caused me to question the whole thing. Is I know people that have the kindest hearts, and they live amazing lives, and they simply don't believe in the same God that Christians do. It seems like the only thing that apologists or that Christians can sort of rationalize the God of the Old Testament with the New is this concept that they call progressive revelation, where it's used to justify the existence of slavery in the Old Testament, suggesting that God gradually revealed moral truths to humanity over time. But that explanation becomes really difficult to reconcile with instances where God is described as issuing absolute, immediate, severe commands. For example, in Deuteronomy 7, 1-2, with the destruction of an entire population of the Canaanites or the Amalekites. There's no indication of a gradual or phased approach. So you have these acts of annihilation that are portrayed as urgent and non-negotiable, and they raise questions of why God would not also issue an outright condemnation of slavery if it were inherently unjust. There's another problematic prophecy that Jesus makes. Matthew 16:28, Mark 9, chapter 1, and Luke 9:27. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here today will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." So he's speaking to his disciples, and he says that some of you who are standing here today will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom, the return of Christ. And that did not happen. All of those people that were standing there are currently dead, and Jesus did not return. So that statement is one that's puzzled scholars and theologians for centuries, because Jesus is saying that the coming of the Son of Man would happen within their lifetime.
Right. It wasn't meant to be this future event, apocalyptic end of the world scenario, with Jesus coming back years and years later. It was meant to be a near future event, right?
Right. These are stories that are written by Iron Age people. And I think the Bible is archaic and it's not really relevant. I feel like there's better, if you're looking for moral books, like how to be a better human, I feel like there's better alternatives than the Bible. I can give some examples. I would encourage listeners to explore different perspectives and interpretations. And the first thing I would suggest is called Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and it's Stoic philosophy. And I think that's a really good way to live your life just in general. The Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu is it teaches simplicity, humility, and living in accordance with natural rhythms, providing moral guidance without a strict set of rules or dogma. Those are, I would say, 2 examples. But there's many, many others. If you're looking for like morality for how to live your life, I think there's better examples in the Bible that don't include horrible things like genocide and rape and slavery and all of that.
Bingo.
There's been a lot to unpack in this episode, and honestly, we could probably sit and talk about this for hours, but for the sake of brevity, I think we'll go ahead and leave it there for today.
All right, well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Please join us again for our next episode, tackling our deconstruction journey. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Bye.